Okay, well, welcome Diana, Peter, and Wesley. Perhaps some others will come as we go along, and others will watch it in the recorded version. I'm really pleased to have two of our graduates from Cal State Fullerton History. We have Ryan Chu, and we have JonLuc Christensen. And I taught Ryan several classes many years ago, well over 10 years ago. Yeah, early in my time, and I never actually had the pleasure of having JonLuc in one of my classes, but I was fortunate enough to meet him at JPL because Dr. Dennehy had taught him, and he very kindly volunteered to give us a personal tour of JPL, and that was really great. It was quite some experience. But you didn't come here to listen to me talk. You came here to listen to our fantastic guest speakers. So I'm going to hand it over. Ryan is going to go first, and hopefully with all the advertising I sent out, you already know what his job title is and where he works for Live Nation Entertainment. And take it away, Ryan.
Great, thanks. Thanks everybody. Thanks so much for your time and showing up here, and I'm glad to bark at you for a few minutes. Kind of give you a little background. My name's Ryan too. As Markley was saying, currently, I'm a senior security analyst for Live Nation Entertainment, and my area of interest and what I focus on is around PCI compliance, PCI being payment card industry. So it is a set of requirements created by the card brands themselves, Visa, MasterCard, all those guys. And they have a set of requirements that everybody who takes credit card payments, whether it's in person, or, online, over the phone, whatever, which way, there's a set of requirements you have to adhere to in order to be compliant with the banks, so you can undergo, proper transactions, you feel safe when you're buying things and all that kind of stuff. So that's my focus for Live Nation Entertainment. So that is in the area of venues for in-person, as well as various ticketing websites and platforms online and e-commerce. So I did not foresee myself in any regard being related to the compliance field when I was at Cal State Fullerton in the history department. I graduated in 2010. My initial picture for my life was going into teaching. I took a year off after I graduated and went and worked in a tech field. I went and worked for an online, like reunion.com at the time, that became My Life and all that stuff. So I've always been interested in tech. I did that for a little bit after, and then I went back to get my teacher credential at Cal State Fullerton. So secondary, I focused being, middle school, high school, completed that about a year and a half. And then I worked pretty heavily as a substitute teacher in the area that I'm in. I was really kind of hound dogs to be a regular sub at a couple schools out here, one in particular. And I spent a lot of time with their staff, but this is post 2008. So there weren't a ton of open positions either at the middle school level or at a high school level. And they were also just rolling out Common Core. And for those who remember that, its implementation was staggered. So you actually had a lot of teachers go and switch gears towards their retirement level to be in social studies because they weren't required to teach Common Core standards in social studies at the time. It only launched in, I think it was math and language arts, maybe science. And so you actually saw a switch. So all these positions were being taken over by seniority, and they weren't being backfilled in some cases. So when I was getting ready to land a job in an area I didn't want to go and move to, I kind of said, do I really want to deal with the bureaucracy of teaching anymore? I had been in that area for a couple of years, and I kind of fell out of it. So at this point in time, I made a pivot. I was always very invested in having tech in the classroom, use of technology, software, hardware, as best as I could get. That kind of led me to find an IT related position. So I had a friend who said, hey, there's a company over here. It's a financial services company. We need somebody who's tech. You know enough. You're pretty personable, which is hard for some IT folks to get into. Some of them are not very friendly. And so I applied for the position. They liked me. I was technical enough for it. And so what happened from there is I liked it from an element of problem solving and being able to engage in that puzzle element. But when you're in IT and you're in a help desk, and by the way, it paid just as well as, teaching for the first couple of years of teaching. So I was happy with that. But my friend said, hey, look, there's only 4 things you can really do once you're in an IT field from help desk. You can either continue up the help desk chain, kind of move yourself into management, be more of a like a device manager. You can go into networking, which is a field I'm not interested in. You can go into systems administration, which involves servers and all that kind of stuff, which is okay, but they're always on really long calls if anything breaks, and that wasn't really what I was interested in doing. And then there was security. So I'm sitting there going, okay, if I'm not going to go back to teaching and I'm going to do this, what am I going to do moving forward? I've already pivoted into IT. What's my next step for myself? And I get bouts of introspection. And so I really kind of leaned back out of both necessity and of trying to make things easier for myself. I said, what are the skills that I actually have? And where did they come from? How did I develop them? And I did review what I had learned while I was a history student, right? You're really into research. So you got to be able to research. You got to be able to compile that data. You've got to be able to analyze that data. You've got to be able to report on that data in a way that makes sense to other people, as well as do it in a fashion that is both standardized. So, I'm very familiar with Turabian Chicago Manual of Style, were my bread and butter. That was my Bible. I have now switched Bibles to a PCI DSS version 4. But I took those elements and said, well, security seems to fit this. There's elements of security that I have to do at this job. I was in financial services, so I dealt with SOC and SOC 2 and PCI. And when you look at the skills that you're developing and this can be kind of expanded to any sort of college pathway, but when you focus on history, I think we kind of do it a little bit better than everybody else when it talks about analysis of data and then reporting on it, especially in a way that's clear and convincing. And there's investigatory work in the history field, and I appreciated that, and I always have, and that lent itself really well into starting to get into this field of compliance. I didn't really consider it compliance at the time. I was just interested in security. So there's the bread and butter security, policy creation, process and procedure documentation through what's called standard operating procedures, SOPs. Lots of companies are really bad at documenting these things. So when you have a person who comes in and they're, hey, I'm very good at creating a format. I'm very good at following that format to a T. I have done long form reporting for years, writing history papers. Let me come in and help draft up policies, procedures, SOPs for you guys. And that way, when it's time to do the assessment, we have that in place. So I started doing that at the job I was in. I just took the skill set I had, I researched what we had available, I created a report, passed it on over to the folks who needed to actually utilize it, and then implemented what I could in my sphere of influence. And then I felt really good about that because I didn't have to try and expand my skill set necessarily. I did have to expand my knowledge base, but the skill set was already built in based on what I was doing here. And then people got familiar with me and what I was doing at that point. And then I had my boss at that time left to go to a different company. I get a call from him a couple of years later. And he says, hey, there's not a lot of people who are familiar with PCI in general. I'd be surprised if a lot of people have even heard of it. And he's like, look, this is a security field. I'd be very interested if you could come on board. It's entry level, but it pays well because it's so few people are interested in it. And I said, okay, yeah, I'm cool with leaving where I'm going. I was already interested in moving into security as kind of where I was pivoting to next. So second pivot out of IT into just security, because being in compliance, I'm no longer dealing with necessarily all the technical elements as I used to. So now I'm strictly in, here is a standard set of things that a company and its entities need to adhere to. And I have to go and do nasty words I don't like auditor and assessor and all that. But it fit very well with the skill set I built out while I was there at Cal State Fullerton in the history department. And so that kind of lent itself to, okay, you're a security analyst, now you're doing PCI work, now you're doing compliance, now you're checking all those boxes. And that's what I've kind of been doing since. So what I was able to kind of give myself some history back is that there are elements of my particular job that involve going to physical on-site venues. It is entertainment, it's live music, it's events and stuff like that. And then I'm able to kind of feed my hunger for some history by learning about the places that I'm going, most of which are very, very old. And that actually can help inform how you can implement certain security standards around a physical space. So if I know a building is so old, then I know that there's going to be restrictions to that building. And so I have to try and find ways around that in order to meet security standards and those type of things. I'm very informal, by the way. So when we have questions, feel free to ask whatever. I'm pretty kosher with that. So when I think about what that looked like for me, it was really out of necessity and kind of organic. I just kind of did a pivot. I followed through with people. And so things that I was very bad at in my college career was networking and like marketing myself. I didn't really think about those things. And when I did, they always kind of rubbed me the wrong way, but they are important. And I think the practicality of that can kind of get lost because you always hear so many people reference and talk about marketing yourself and networking. But the whole thing that I did at school was, hey, let's make connections with people in classrooms so I can keep up to date on stuff when I'm not available. Let's go ahead and talk to my professors, which all of that rapport building really lent itself very well into allowing myself to market myself later. So instead of Markley here that I would go to his office hours, which I did frequently, I would just chime in my boss and be like, hey, you got some couple minutes to chit chat in the office? So I really just applied everything that I was already doing in college to just other elements in my life by being introspective and then kind of being organic with it. I'm not sure if I would necessarily recommend that approach because it is costly to go get a teaching credential and then decide not to. But if I do get that question asked, oh, would you do it again knowing you're not going to go back to it? I'm like, yeah, well, I would gladly spend that money, even though I don't have it at the time, to know that I don't have to go back later and say to myself, okay, well, what if? No, I already figured it out. I will always respect and love that profession, but it just not for me. So I had to find something that worked. And I feel like going through those introspective moments and kind of making my connections allowed me to really put down on paper a skill set. And that's the last thing that I'll kind of recommend to you is that work towards a resume. Always be kind of putting it together, always be thinking about it, making it applicable to a variety of things by distilling down what you're doing now into the core fundamental skill that requires you to do it. And I didn't think about that when I was a student. I didn't have that kind of level of introspection on the functions of what I was doing. I was just doing what I needed to do to get by, get my papers in, do all that. But getting into my mid to late 20s and going like, what am I capable of doing? How can I organize that? How can I structure that out? I really had to think about what did I develop and how. So yeah, I was writing papers and making sure I was getting stuff turned in on time, but that was time management. That was working independently. That was being able to do my research and to formulate a report that someone's going to read and grade on, right? And that's all related to job stuff later. I can't tell you how important, especially now in our previous conversation, working remotely and time management and being able to manage yourself and your own projects around that are very important. So that is kind of the big one. Be introspective about your skill set. Constantly look at the function of how you're completing the tasks that you're doing and try and find a way to turn that into something you can add to your resume and build rapport with the folks that you're doing along the way. Your professors, your other folks in class that you might be able to learn something from. And then when you go places and something seems interesting, ask questions. Talk to people about it. I always like getting asked questions about stuff when I'm on a site, and I'm sure some of those folks don't mind answering certain questions, and always be inquisitive, always be researching, which is I think what most of us wanted when we got into this anyway. Not just that we love old tales of things, but we wanted to know what those people were thinking and how they're doing. And in the same regard with what I do in security, I have to look at a subset of data and try and make a narrative out of that. That's my way of fulfilling something I was already doing. So I guess that's all I have to say. I know I sped through that, but I'm trying to make sure I'm not coughing too much, getting over the flu. Markley, do we have a set open period for questions?
Yes, just hang on. My camera just died on me. I don't know what it was. How do I, if you don't do anything, start video? Ah, there it is.
There you go.
It must have, if you don't do anything, it must turn off. Okay. Actually, I would like to follow up and ask a couple of questions first before I open up to other people.
Absolutely.
And one of them was actually just to get you to recap something you said, because as you were saying it, I was thinking, thank goodness I'm recording this. We've got to put this on our website somewhere about one of the reasons why you should do a history degree. It was the part where you were talking about how the skill set you developed in writing essays was really good for developing like SOPs, I think it was, or standard operating procedures. Was that? I mean,
Oh, sure.
like all I get lost sometimes in the jargon. So it's the SOPs.
Yeah. All right. So
So
let me give
yeah,
a small little tidbit on how what I do and my actual function of my role is right now.
yeah,
So when I engage with an entity, Live Nation owns a bunch of smaller companies and they also own venues. And so when I look at an entity, I have to properly scope that entity out, which means I have to do research on a bunch of different things in regards to how that entity is physically secure, how they handle card payments, how they conduct themselves with any e-commerce. And so a lot of people, and then this is across the board, almost every place I've ever worked, have really defined ways that they do things. Almost none of it is written down. So very few things are written down in a proper way or a standard way or what have you. And so when I got out of being in history and academia, like when you're writing a paper, I stuck to Chicago manual style. I stuck to what was requested of me in that prompt, right? And that required a bunch of independent research, formulation of my thesis and being able to create an argument, and then being able to properly convey that concisely and as clearly as possible. I do the exact same thing when I create a scoping document for the entities that I work with. And then I have to distill down, hey, here's all the stuff that you guys do. This is why I think we need to approach it this way. This is what we need to look at, right? Very similar to what I was doing when I was writing reports. And then when we're talking about standard operating procedures, now we're getting into a document has to look the same. It's standard across the board from one venue to another. When I go from one house of blues to another house of blues, they need to have the same thing, right? And you'd think they would, but they're all very independently managed because this is an entertainment business. So we have to draft up something that says, hey, when you have visitors, this is how you have to, ingest a visitor and properly record them and all that. That's a standard operating procedure. So that has to be very formatted. And I learned how to properly format something and kind of stick to a set of organizational tools and referencing by being so into Chicago manual style and being in Turabian. I worked on the Wellebathan there for like 3 or 4 years. And so I was an editor like crazy all the time. I loved it. And so being able to do that, I applied directly to writing SOPs, policy documents. And it was very natural for me to go from being able to follow one subset of how to write things and how to properly organize them, and then prompts from my professors to, I have a framework, a security framework, I have to then implement into a document that then gets used by folks at a venue, online, what have you. So I don't know if that answers your question clearly enough, but that is one way that worked really well for me because it is not difficult. I knocked out a ton of them this week because I had to push out as much. I'm going on vacation. Those people are going to have to figure out what to do with it when I'm gone. So that's one of the things that is very prevalent in the security and compliance world is you have to standardize certain things. You have to make sure it's on paper.
Can I jump in here for just a moment if we can kind of take this a little bit more conversational, because I'm not going to touch on this as much when in my portion, but I just want to echo a lot of what Ryan's saying. I mean, everything that he's saying about standard operating procedures and all of that is stuff that I do as part of my job. And I attribute a lot of that back to my history degree. But there's a couple other aspects to it that I think, Ryan, you haven't mentioned that I think, you probably do have the benefit of from having your history degree. And so when we're writing our standard operating procedures, or what we call desk instructions, one of the things that you have to recognize is that people with history degrees are exceptionally good writers. We have an ability to be able to write in a way that people can understand what we're trying to convey, especially when you're talking about very complex subjects. In my world, science and engineering, scientists and engineers are not very good writers. So we with the history degree fill in a lot of that gap. And that also goes to what you write for one person when you're trying to write these standard operating procedures may not make sense to everybody, because everybody has different perspectives, everybody has different viewpoints. I've always said my history degree was fundamentally a degree in bias detection. We are really good with a history degree in being able to see multiple perspectives and then see beyond what's just there to, okay, well, this person wrote in their journal, 250 years ago, X, Y, and Z. All right. But if they wrote this as a, upper class white woman versus a lower class, white woman versus, an African-American male in the North versus an African-American male in the South, there are a lot of different factors that go into why they might have that perspective. We're really good at figuring that out, right? We're really good at filling in some of the gaps and looking at context and clues. And so what that does, I think, is makes us really good technical writers, because you can write an instruction that makes perfect sense to one person and makes no sense to somebody else. Talk to that person and be able to figure out, oh, I see where the gap is. You may not be able to understand where the gap is, but I see where the gap is. And now I can rewrite this in a way that it makes sense to both parties. And historians are exceptionally good at writing like that. So, and it's something that I think is underutilized or not thought about as well when people take their history degree and they're trying to say, okay, what am I going to do with this?
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And I've always said, really, when you study history, you're being trained in how to detect bias and being as objective as possible, right? So the application of that in technical writing, like you were saying, it's very hard to try and convey a subset of requirements for something like compliance to tech folks who that's not their job. Their job isn't to know what requirements are. You have to be able to bridge that gap. And similarly, if you could find yourself working in the same position and deal with a variety of people, right? I work internationally with folks all over the world, and how you approach security is also going to be dependent on a whole different subset of compliance, and I'll include privacy here. So privacy, you've got, the CCPA in California, you've got the GDPR in Europe. You have to be able to convey to these teams, internationally speaking, hey, how does this make sense for you here when your technical constraints are entirely different? And you have to be able to bridge those gaps for them. And they're not really interested because they want to do their job. They want to do the function of what they do, which, yes, is inclusive of security, but it's not their job to know it. It's not their job to understand it. It's ours to facilitate that. And so being able to recognize that and being able to kind of see the other side of things, being able to see that makes the ability to do it a lot better too, because when you go into something and you have somebody like an assessor and an auditor and they're kind of just nitpicking at you about things and you don't understand, that person doesn't understand what your actual job and role is, and that you might not understand these things, will cause contention in getting things done. I've seen this before. I've definitely worked with assessors who didn't understand why these people weren't getting this done. Well, maybe if you look at it from the perspective of a networking guy, isn't going to know anything about your PCI compliance and not going to know anything about privacy laws in Europe when his focus is on how to do VPNs. I'm getting a little bit into the weeds on that. But yeah, I think that absolutely goes with it. What you were saying is when you can observe multiple perspectives, it helps you to communicate what you're trying to communicate better. And that is very apparent in how we write. And I am the person on the team who gets you get the first draft of everything, right? I'm sure this happens to you too. You get people ask you to look at papers to make sure, is my grammar good? Is the structure good? Does this make sense? Yeah, this is something that you'll probably be accustomed to as a history major moving forward. Is people will expect you to look at their stuff because they know you're going to be the person who wrote more than they did. So yeah.
And I think it goes into it's not just writing, it's interpersonal communication, it's things like that, because I can't tell you how many times the person with the history degree is the one who gets brought in for conflict resolution, or when there's because when two people are each giving you a story, and you're trying to figure out which one's right, and obviously, typically it's a little bit of truth from both. You can be a really effective communicator at saying, listen, so I see this is how you saw it, this is how you saw it, this is probably what actually happened. And you can be a really effective communicator in that. And Ryan, I was going to say, you kind of were when you were talking about being a teacher, and you were saying, you wouldn't really trade it in, but it was an expensive, kind of detour. I would argue it probably was pretty helpful, because when you're in compliance and things like that, you have to teach people what this stuff is. You have to help them understand. And I would bet that those skills can come in handy. I mean, I know they do for me with teaching at a university level.
Very much so. It's definitely useful when you have to meet with I deal with people who are trying to sell tickets and make people have a good time at a show. And so when you try and educate them on something like card security requirements and privacy laws, yeah, you have to be able to educate folks in a way that makes sense to them. Isn't going to turn them off, because you're going to need them to do things for you. So it's very important. Yeah, I totally agree. I can't hear you.
Dr. Markley, you're muted.
Thank you. Okay, this is brilliant, because so often when am I muted again? No, my camera
not muted. Your camera's up though.
My camera keeps dying on me. I don't know what's going on. Okay, I'll just keep talking even if the picture disappears. Oh, there it goes again. Okay, but you can hear me still?
Yeah.
So, history professors get together, but most of us, of course, have worked in universities most of our life. So when we're trying to think, gee, how does this stuff we're teaching the students actually apply in the real world when you get out into the workforce? It's actually quite hard for us to do, because we're not speaking from a position of experience. And I just want to say thank you to you both, because I'm going to have to go back through the recording and take notes, so we can put it on our website somewhere about selling to students why you should do a history degree, all the great skills you'll acquire, and why it's so useful later in life. Okay, let's open it up to the broader audience. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask Ryan? Oh, and the way we're going to do it, well, I don't know, are they able to unmute themselves, or do they, do you know they are?
They should be able to.
Okay, so if not, just send a text message in the chat. Since we don't have a huge number of people here, I'm counting 7 people at the moment. I don't think we need to do it too formal with raising hands. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi, sorry, I'm gonna have to leave pretty soon. I didn't catch where this will be posted.
I haven't worked that out yet. I'm sorry, I'm not the most technical person yet. So I will probably put it on Dropbox and then create a link, and perhaps I'll ask the history department to spam it out to all the emails if anybody wants to see it. So look for an announcement in an email.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
I actually have a question.
Hey, Maria.
I was just wondering, Ryan, do you have your bachelor's or your bachelor's and your master's in history as well?
No, just my bachelor's. I did bachelor's, and then right after did the teaching credential. I didn't continue in education when I kind of ceased being in academia.
Okay, but you did get your teaching credential and you taught for a little while?
Yeah, I did. And then that about a couple years, not in an area that I was really interested in staying. And that was a contributing factor in me making a pivot out of education too. So, but yeah, just my bachelor's at the time. Didn't follow through further than that, although I would have loved to. I just, after that, it became a certification. So when you get into IT and technical things, you typically go get a certification of something. So I am what's called an ISA for internal security assessor. That's my certification, or a PCIP PCI professional. But when you can branch out into a bunch of different things. So certifications are always good to look up. They're not always terribly expensive. And a lot of the times you can get an employer to pay for some of them or reimburse you for them if it helps towards fulfilling some of your objectives. So I also recommend looking into that if there's an area you're interested in, like compliance or anything in the tech fields.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. So for the both of you, after graduation, did you guys find yourself taking additional classes after you graduated for the jobs that you guys are in now?
Mine will be brief, so I'll jump in real quick here. I did take about a semester worth of extra classes when I was going into teaching, because I was interested in it when I was doing my undergrad, but I wasn't convinced. So I took a year to go work in tech, and then I decided I wanted to approach teaching. So then I did about a semester's worth of educational classes, and then the actual credential program was 2 semesters. For what I'm doing now, as I said, it was just mostly on the job learning and certifications. So I did pay some out of pocket. And then when I got to the level I'm at now, the company paid for it because they needed people to be technically certified as an ISA to run internal assessments. And the folks who had previously done it left, and I volunteered. So it's another thing I always recommend is if people ask you for things, it's usually good to volunteer, check it in, be vocal, be as communicative and open as possible, because the more you're seen, the more likely people are going to think about you. So I didn't take anything other than certifications, though, for what I've been doing now.
Okay, thank you.
I won't take too long on it just because I'm going to talk about it a little bit more when it's my turn. But yes, I mean, I have a master's. So I went on for a master's in library and information sciences. So that pulled me a bit more towards my specific area. But what it is, to be fair, when I got my starting position, I was only in my first semester of my master's. So, the internship was available to me because I was in an education program, but I did, at least at the point that I started, have the fundamental skills that I needed in order to start in the position with just my bachelor's degree.
Okay, thank you.
Mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. I'm back in. Yep. Does anybody else have any questions I'd like to ask? Well, one of the things, and it's more of a comment, but I'll throw it out there for you to comment on. One of the things, like when people are thinking of jobs, like I'm thinking more like you ask an elementary school kid, what job would you like to do? There's sort of a basic list that people think of jobs. I could be a teacher, I could be a doctor, I could be a pilot, I could be a fireman. And there's like you could probably only put 20 things down on that list. And yet, what I've come to realize is I've met people and so on. There's so many other jobs out there. Like honestly, I'm not sure there's that many people out there who even know how big a field security is and how many jobs there are in it. Nobody kind of goes, oh, what do you want to be? Oh, I want to be a security specialist. And yet that's the bread and butter for, well, it must be thousands of people. So would you like to comment on that?
On just like finding what it is as I started in the beginning, I would never have thought myself as being in compliance. It wasn't anything. You pointed to the job that I picked, right? Teacher. And I value and respect that position. And I have, my sister and her husband still are. I love talking to them about it. But I made a pivot for personal reasons, and then on top of that, financial reasons. And it was very organic for me to move into something else, which is why I brought up making sure you contact and talk to people, and you continuously build yourself as something marketable, and you continue to network by just making connections and being part of communities and stuff like that, because you will find things that you didn't know existed. I didn't even know what PCI was. Some people find out when they get hacked. So, if you've had that experience, that might lead you down that path. I know that one of the people that I work
PCI, with, what does PCI stand for again?
Payment card industry. So I don't know how long ago now, the card brands, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, all those folks really did it because it's costly to deal with fraud. So when you have fraud on your account, right, and somebody has to pay for it, those are transactions that they have to cover. That's stuff that they have to be worried about. That opens themselves up to financial loss when there's more fraud or potential fraud. So to cut that as much in the bud as possible, they said, you guys have to be responsible by adhering to these subset of things. That way we eliminate fraud on the account. It protects our cardholders, and it eliminates all these transactions that we're going to have to pay for, or your bank is going to have to pay for, just right from the get-go. Now there's always going to be, there's white hat and black hat hackers who try and work on stuff to move this forward. There's always new elements. I can't tell you how often I have to deal with cyber attacks from overseas is a big one. There's all kinds of elements that you have to think about in moving that forward. And while I don't work with some of that directly, I work with the teams that do, and I provide them with their security framework that they have to operate in to try and implement that to protect us. And it's a constant back and forth. I think a lot of people end up moving into positions just because they've just organically wound up where they are. Some people, I'm going to do this and that's what I'm going to do, and that's what they do. Some people like me kind of figure out what works based on what you can already do, and then meeting people and talking to them opens the doors for the opportunities that come, right? So because I focused on what I am able to do, made me very marketable. People remember me. I frequently get hit up by former people that I've worked with. Hey, do you want to come work for us over here? Do you want to do that? That happens often enough because I really honed in the things that I could do from a skill set, and I understood how I developed that so I could continue to develop that, and that started there at CSUF.
Great, thank you. Well, that's why I called this panel Unexpected Journeys, because, for some, as you say, some people have a straight shot from what they want to do and they go and do it. But I think for most of us, myself included, it's a long and windy road before you end up doing what's going to become your thing. Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. I found that really interesting, and I hope the rest of our guests did. And on that note, JonLuc, can we hand it over to you and let's hear your story?
Sure. So I had originally made some slides for this. I'm not going to really use them a whole lot, but there are a couple that I will show, but I'll do that in a few minutes. So kind of to kick it off here, I'm JonLuc Christensen. I'm really excited to be here speaking to you, and so thank you, Dr. Markley, for having me. The first thing I like to start off talks like this when I have them is to remind people that imposter syndrome is real, and everyone has it. A story I like to share is that I was in a talk at JPL. Our speaker had 3 bachelor's degrees, 2 master's degrees, and dual PhD in computation and neuroscience. She was absolutely brilliant. Nominated for multiple Emmys, was a science writer. Absolutely brilliant person, right? And she's talking about imposter syndrome, and I'm sitting in a theater of about 1,000 of the world's top scientists and engineers. And she asked everybody in the room who had ever felt like an imposter to raise their hand. And I will tell you, about 980 people in that room were raising their hand. So I say that because as I start to talk, people can sometimes get intimidated because it seems like I've done a lot, and it seems like the things I do are very complicated, but they're not. A lot of my journey was very lucky. A lot of my journey was about, being flexible when opportunities came around, like Ryan said, just kind of following the path, and just kind of saying yes to opportunities. So just as I go through the presentation, just remember that if you feel intimidated by anything I'm saying, or it sounds overwhelming, like you couldn't do it, you can. You're still early in your academic careers. All of this is kind of a process. So, and the other thing I like to remind people is one of my favorite quotes, and it's that smart people learn from their mistakes, wise people learn from the mistakes of others. And I think being here and listening to folks like Ryan and I talk, is great for all of you. I think you're on the right path to that. Kind of learn from our mistakes, learn from our path, learn from our experiences, and try to utilize that in your own life. All right, so my background a little bit. I went to Cal State Fullerton, of course. I got my Bachelor of Arts in History and a minor in Anthropology. I graduated in 2016. When I was there, I became a member of Phi Alpha Theta and Lambda Alpha. I wrote for the Wellabethan, got a couple of awards from Phi Alpha Theta and from the history department. So I had a really good experience, but I'll admit most of that did not happen for me until my junior and senior years. I worked full time, so I didn't have, the opportunity to really dive into, the true academic life. And I waited till very late in my academic career to actually start getting involved with things like Phi Alpha Theta, the history, Honor Society, and a few different other groups that ultimately gave me a lot of opportunities. So I really recommend that if you're not doing it, start getting involved with those types of groups that can be networking and support groups for you. For myself, I got published. I won several awards and things that I never would have done had I not gotten involved in those groups. So I really, really encourage you all to do that. So during my undergrad, I focused a lot on, merging and interdisciplinary approaches. So while I was doing my history degree, again, I did that minor in anthropology, and I really focused on human behavior and cultural anthropology. But from a historic perspective. And I really wanted to focus on how to use those two fields together. And it's something that I have continued to do throughout my career, both academically and professionally. So my plan at the end of my my bachelor's program was to continue on through a master's in history to a PhD in history. I was one of those little kids who wanted to be a teacher when they were younger. I didn't know what I wanted to teach. I thought I wanted to be an astrophysicist. I thought I wanted to have a PhD in physics. Loved watching the universe on History Channel. Got into high school, hit chemistry my sophomore year, and realized I was not going to be a scientist. Well, I went from loving science my freshman year and earlier, started hating it my sophomore year, and kind of found this love for history. So my path kind of changed a little bit. Finished my undergrad, and as I was getting close to the end there, I was speaking with one of my my professors who I was very close with and kind of served as a mentor to me. I won't say who they are, but I basically told them I was not going to be pursuing a master's in history. And their response was no. Plain and simple, you are going to be in our master's program. You need to do this. You're silly to not pursue it. And I explained I wanted to go into, I was going to pivot to library and information sciences, that I still intended to come back for a history PhD someday. But I thought that this would be an extra set of skills. It would improve my ability to research, and it would give me some other opportunities in the market. They agreed, let me go a little bit, but I went down that path, and I started my master's at San Jose State, our sister school. And this time I decided I was going to give it my all. I had saved up enough money that I could pay for my master's without working, so I wasn't going to work like I did in my undergrad. I had learned my lesson about getting involved with professional development and student groups, and so I was going to jump right in my freshman year. I joined the Special Libraries Association, which was not where I thought I would be, because I thought I was going to be an academic librarian, an academic, going to become a professor. But I joined the Special Libraries Association because it was something different. It was a different opportunity. And in my first semester there, while working with the Special Libraries Association student chapter, I learned about an internship opportunity at JPL. It was to work in records and archives. And I thought, I have no experience in this. I'm first semester in my master's degree. Why not? Let's try it. Let's see what happens. So I applied, got the interview, and again, looked at my past experiences, looked at those transferable skills. So when I was working, or when I was going to school at Cal State Fullerton, I had done some research in the Center for Oral and Public History. I had taken a class in public history, so I was vaguely familiar with what an archive was. I kind of worked in one. I knew some of the basics. And so I kind of, faked it till I made it my way through the interview, using those buzzwords. And then they started asking me about, well, what about records? I mean, I don't know, I've never done records in my life. But I know that I'm working at, or that I'm applying at a government agency. I know basically what a record is. It's a document about the business processes. And during my undergrad, I had worked full-time for AAA, and I did their DMV services. And so I had been handling government records. And so I talked about, handling government records and people's privacy, and knowing, about having to shred materials and how to safeguard and things like that. And in the end, they came back to me and said, well, we have a better candidate for the archives. Where the archives is working on a photo project. We have a candidate who has a background in photography, and we're going to give them that position. But we'd like to offer you the records position. So I accepted the internship, spent a summer there during my first semester doing that while I was at SJSU. Luckily, I knew that I was working in a department that was understaffed. And so when the internship was about to end, I basically said, would you keep me on as an academic part-time? I can work part-time for you. I know you need the help. I've been here for 3 months. I have my feet under me now. And they said, okay. And about 5 months later, there was some more turnover in the group. And I basically said, listen, I've been here for about 9 months now. I've got more experience than any new person you're going to bring in. Why don't you promote somebody up to the position you're trying to fill and bring me in as an entry-level person? And they did. And so I was very, very fortunate to have the opportunity. But again, I leveraged those transferable skills. I was now solidly in records and archives. And while I was there, I was using my skills in research. I was using my skills in, and some just my respect for the history. That you'd be amazed at how many people will walk into an archive, and because they don't have that respect for the history, they don't value its safety, its security, its the fragility of the materials that we're working with. So I was constantly leaning back on my background in history, my love of it, my appreciation for it, and really showing that enthusiasm for the work that we were doing at JPL and the historic nature of it, to really kind of solidify and express my passion for the work. It's science and engineering. It's not true history, but I was able to show a respect for it that I think the management valued, and gave me kind of that one up on staying there. Just taking a look at my notes really quickly because I'm kind of bouncing around here. So let me talk a little bit about, and I'll go ahead and share my slides now. A little bit about the work that I actually do at JPL, and tie it back to my history degree a little bit, and hopefully, kind of inspire some of you to see how, unique ways that you can use your degree. I probably should have said this before. So I work at JPL, that's the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We are a federally funded research and development center, an FFRDC, for NASA. So we're managed by the California Institute of Technology. That's actually my employer is Caltech, but we do all the work for NASA related to, not all of the work, most of the work related to the robotic exploration of space. So you might know us, and I should change my slide here. So you might know us for things like the Mars rovers, the Voyager spacecraft, and a number of other very famous missions, Juno, Cassini. But basically what we do is we do the exploration of deep space using robotic spacecraft. And so, when I started there, again, started as an intern in records management. Most of my work when I first started was around, well, first of all, I'll show you a couple of the fun pictures we have here. That's what I should have started with. So this is our main administration building here in the bottom corner. In the middle is our entrance to mission control. This is also where what's called the Deep Space Network is. The Deep Space Network is basically a series of satellites and antenna around the world that funnel all the communications from beyond the moon. So any spacecraft, regardless of what country it is, including Russia and China, must filter their data through us because we are the only ones with satellite network that can actually manage and handle the material from those distances. So mission control is really cool. And then in the side here, I've just got this model of the facility that I work at. So JPL is built on 188 acres in Pasadena, and we're built right up against the mountainside. We've got, I think, 150 buildings, about 10,000 people, all working for JPL. All right, going back to this slide, the picture in the bottom corner, that's mission control. There's actually a fun observation area that I'm standing in right up there where we can sit and just eat lunch and watch mission control the rovers and things like that. It's pretty fun. We're a little spoiled in that. We have our own R2-D2 because we're robot experts. And so you can see there, that is a functioning R2-D2, walks around, will beep at you and interact with you and things. It's kind of fun. The picture in the middle is kind of hard to see. That is a replica of the InSight lander, which was my first mission that I worked on. It landed on Mars. It's coming to an end of its mission, but that's one of the test beds where we have a model of it that they use to test everything because we have to see how it's going to work here on Earth before we can send a command to Mars. And then the top up there is a clean room, that big white room there, where many of our most famous missions were built. And in the back, if you can see it, in really small area right there, that is the sky crane. That is the part of the spacecraft that actually drops the rovers onto Mars when they've gone through the atmosphere. And going back to that respect for history, a pair of my white gloves that I use to handle all of our materials. All right, so for my internship, what was I really doing and how did my history degree really help with that? The start of my internship was dealing with all of these paper legacy materials. So we had about 150,000 physical engineering drawings that had to be inventoried in a very systematic way. And these are engineering drawings that go all the way back to the 30s. So they're very delicate and fragile. And so we had to do that. We also have about 1.7 million aperture cards. These are a type of scan of paper records that are stored on these cards with a little film strip in them. Managing, cataloging, and figuring out where all of this stuff is a pretty big undertaking. And it takes people who have really good research skills to be able to manage and find these materials. When you have 150,000 engineering drawings and all of the data you have about it is an engineering document number, a unique number that's assigned to it, it can be a bit of a research endeavor to find it. So those of us with history degrees are very good at finding those nuanced pieces of information among large piles of documents. And then the other part was what we call digital assets management. So this was actually scanning the materials and then applying what we call metadata, so descriptive information about them, categorizing them and uploading them to a system. Again, something that historians are very good at. We're very good at sorting and organizing. We take, very big piles of mess oftentimes when we're doing our research, and we have to organize it in a way that people can understand it and make it usable. And so that's a lot of what my internship was. So again, did not have an experience as a master's in library and information science yet, but I did have that history degree. And I was able to do this well enough that they decided to keep me on. All right, so it worked. I stayed on as an academic part-time, and my duties were largely a lot of the same, but they also added me to the circulation desk of the library because they needed additional help there. And so I was able to use my skills in research as a historian to basically assist users who were coming in trying to do their own research. They needed to find books that were applicable to the work that they were doing. I can search a catalog like nobody's business because I have a degree in history and I have been searching libraries and internet catalogs and that sort for a very long time. So it was, and then I had also used some of that customer experience that I had in the past at AAA to make sure that I was, keeping our patrons happy and so on and so forth. Let me see here. I'm trying to skip through my notes because I don't want to bog you down with too much. But basically, after the end of the summer in November of 2017, I took that opportunity, like I talked about again, to put myself out there to be an early career hire. It was at that point that I decided, okay, it's really time to tailor my education to this. So fortunately, I was in my master's program. I was able to tailor to a lot of these things that I didn't have experience with, such as compliance, which records retention and disposition is all about compliance, and that. At the same time, I was also able to do something because of my history degree that not everybody was very good at in our department. With the people that I'm working with at JPL, we're talking about scientists and engineers who are doing one-of-a-kind work that nobody else in the history of humankind has ever done and will likely ever do again. One of the examples I give are the Voyager spacecrafts. The Voyagers have been flying for over 45 years now. They were the first man-made objects to exit the solar system. They were some of the first spacecraft to ever image Jupiter and Saturn and the outer planets. The people who worked on Voyager, now mind you, this is a project that has been flying for 45 years. It was 20 years in development. The people who were working on those missions literally spent their entire careers working on one project, one mission. And that is a mission that relied on a specific alignment of the planets to be able to make possible that only happens every 300 years. So when I say this is stuff that will only happen once in humankind, in human history, that's something that's serious. And the people who worked on these projects love them. They have spent 40, 50, 60 years on them. They are passionate about them. And you'd be amazed at how many people don't respect that history. And when you do have a respect for that history as a historian, when you can go back and explain why documentation about it is important, you build a lot of trust in the records world that allows these people to give over these materials to you so that they can be put in an archive, they can be preserved, they can be protected in a way that they'll also be used in the future. And historians have a really good ability to express that level of respect that a lot of people don't. And so, whether it be here at JPL, I mean, I have colleagues who work for Lululemon, archiving their materials at a fashion company. I have a colleague who works for the WWE, doing the same thing. You'd be amazed at the opportunities that are out there, and historians have a very unique ability to kind of get in there, preserve those materials, and kind of have that respect and that appreciation for it. So yeah, sorry, I'm kind of rambling here. Yeah, so I was able to do that and show that respect, and that made me a very valued member of the team. And so once I was brought in as full-time, there was a major issue that was happening in our group where records management has a very set of skills and requirements that they are beholden to. And the archives is very different. Records are needed to support the business. The archives are needed to respect the history and to preserve the history. And sometimes those two things conflict. And so an example I can give is there are sometimes recorded materials that are ready to be destroyed because they have legally sensitive information that retaining can damage in some situations. And so you want to get rid of them when their time comes. Something like HR records for people who are no longer part of your agency. But the archives wants to preserve that history. They want to know who those people were. They want to know what those people did. And so those two departments can often conflict. Well, having now spent about a year in records, but being a historian by my undergraduate trade, I was able to have that respect for both sides and was able to kind of play that mediator. And so I was tasked with forming what they call the Records and Archives Integration Task Force. I used, again, some of those skills we were talking about earlier with conflict mediation and conflict resolution, being able to see multiple perspectives. And I brought together a group of the records managers and a group of the archivists and got them into a room for a series of meetings basically every other week for over 2 years. And we're able to integrate all of our processes, procedures, workflows into one unified system. So that way, all the business records were coming into records, but we were early on being able to recognize and capture what was going to be historically significant and manage those from away at the start to ensure that they would make it to the archives. And in doing that, we were able to get materials to the archives that normally wouldn't have made it there. And that allowed me to build trust with the archivists to be able to get them to let go of some of the other materials that records really didn't want to be keeping, that were a problem for records. And so it was a little bit of a give and a take. There's lots of negotiation. There was lots of having to listen to what the archivists were on about with their perspective, and a lot of with the records managers. And ultimately, what I think we did over 2 years was we created a process that will best preserve the history of JPL and the work that we do in ways that we had not been effective at doing in our 80 plus years before it. And again, I really attribute that to a lot of my skills with being a historian. All right, so that's the last of the slides that I'm going to show. Yep, that's one of the Mars rovers. That's or a replica of it. We generally make about 3. You have the one that goes actually into space. You have one that's on the ground that we test with, and there's usually one for display and education purposes. Again, historians are really good at educating people, and that's another value that we have is when you have materials like this. We can generate a lot of excitement about it. And excitement is what brings in public funding. It's what brings in, those cool stories and things are often what get people interested and allows us to do our work of preserving our history. So what I didn't talk about, and I kind of want to end with here, see, I'll go back to here. So as you can see on this slide, I have a lot of titles and roles. At JPL, I'm the technical group lead now for records and archives. I am a Freedom of Information Act liaison, which I'll get into more in a minute. I am also an information configuration management engineer. And this is specifically for a project called the Cold Atom Laboratory that's on board the International Space Station. So I'm gonna take just a minute here. How am I doing on time? No. Probably running a little long.
I think we're good. Okay. You can I schedule it to go to 8:30. It's only 8:05. So
okay. So I'll try not to take too much longer on it so we can get to questions and conversation. But yeah, so I'll talk about just a couple of things. So and why they relate to our history degrees. So first off, the information configuration management engineering that I do, that's about 10% of my work. I do this again specifically for the Cold Atom Laboratory, which is a science instrument on board the International Space Station. And what my job is I am basically a document and information manager. I am trained to understand and implement institutional information management requirements, processes, and tools that I apply to, things like including rigorous change control for the documentation, the requirements, the design, and the operations documents of this hardware and software that's doing this really cool science. So ultimately, it is my job to protect the integrity of the mission. And in addition to protecting the integrity of the mission, to protect the history of the mission. This has 2 applications. This protects both the industry that I'm in and the organization that I work for, but it also does things, again, like generating the excitement from the public that brings us our funding and keeps people interested and relevant. And my history degree helps me with that. So again, all of that technical writing, being used to, like Ryan was saying, standards and templates and all of that allows me to make sure that I can manage the documents for this project in a way that ensures that they are authentic, that things are not improperly changed, that they are true and accurate representations of the events that happened. And that's important because, again, in 2 years, that might be important if something fails in the hardware, or something goes wrong with the project. But then in 30 years, because we have this documentation, because it followed these specific procedures, in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, when historians are looking back on these materials and they are, studying them and trying to figure out what happened and how this was accomplished and how this once in a lifetime work was achieved, they will have resources in our archives, in our collections that they know are authentic, that they know are true and real, and that should hopefully make their research easier. And as a historian, as somebody with that historic background, I recognize that value, and so it makes me really good at my job and at explaining this to people, especially the scientists and engineers that I work with who, this is in the way of their work. This slows things down for them, and they don't always appreciate its value. And I can help communicate that to them so that way we can preserve these events for the future. All right, so FOIA, this one I'll be really quick on. Freedom of Information Act requests. This is the method that some of you may have used as historians, in which you can request information from the government. You can request records from the federal government on basically anything, with few exceptions related to national security and some of those. So all those requests come into my office. I lead a couple of people on the team in responding to those requests. So we have to try to figure out what the person's asking for, find materials, do the research of what's responsive, look at compliance, see what we can and cannot release, and then get those out to the researchers. Sometimes this means digging through our archive. Sometimes this means digging through some weird database somewhere. Oftentimes it means talking with stakeholders across the lab who know a lot more about the subject that's being asked about than I do. And oftentimes, depending upon the materials, we can't release them through FOIA, but we can send them over to the archives, and we can field research requests through the archives. And again, my history background and research background helps with all of that and makes me pretty good at it. The other thing is it's very legalistic and it's very technical. So those really clear technical writing skills are again, very, very helpful. All right, and last is my role as the technical group lead. Not going to go into this a whole lot. I lead the team on a process called electronic records management. We're transitioning our entire laboratory from paper records and actually printing things out to fully electronic records keeping. Remember, this is hundreds of projects across the lab, 10,000 users. We touch every aspect of it, and getting all of this transferred from traditional paper analog to electronic is very difficult, especially doing those things like maintaining the authenticity, working in technical systems to ensure that this stuff is taken care of and preserved and will last, which is very different in an electronic environment than it is in a paper environment. Do lots of other things, write lots of policy, write lots of governance, and such. So, but that's about 70% of my work. It's the less cool stuff, but often it's the type of stuff that historians are very, very good at. So yeah. And then I also teach. So I teach, I have a bachelor's, so I teach in the Bachelor's of Science in Information Science and Data Analytics program at San Jose State. I specifically teach a class on culture, technology, culture, and society. This class focuses on the legal, ethical, political, and social implications of data analysis and use, with an emphasis on historic perspectives and DEIA issues. I didn't go a whole lot into my DEIA background for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, but it's something that I think I'm particularly good at because, again, I'm really good at seeing those multiple perspectives. I'm really good at that emotional communication, emotional intelligence type things, and I attribute a lot of that to my history background in being able to identify and really see the big picture when often you have very little evidence of what's actually going on. And so while my master's degree is technically what allows me to teach that class at a university level, a lot of it is really my history degree that I'm using. A lot of it is really those historic perspectives when you're trying to understand social implications of facial recognition, having that background in history and having that research background to understand racial bias and why, African Americans may be treated differently than Caucasian people when it comes to facial recognition is often rooted in histories of slavery and inequality in this country, and so I'm able to use that in my teaching. And so to end it all, because I keep saying that I'm right about done, I was just a couple of tips that I recommend for all of you. Get involved in those professional connections. Look for internships, get involved with student groups, get involved any way that you can. In my experience, this has led to my current job. It's served as evidence for promotions and why I'm worthy of promotions. So get involved. This also lets you build leadership skills, and leadership skills are something that are not teachable in a classroom. But there's something that are generally learned through experience. And so this helps with that. Imposter syndrome, again, is real. I've been in the same position all of you were. I was that lowly undergraduate student who had no idea what the heck they were going to do with their life. But you'll get through it. The best thing you can do is keep talking to people, talk to people like me, like Ryan, your professors, go to office hours, make friends, make introductions. Some of my greatest friends and mentors and allies have been my professors from undergrad. I've been able to, give tours to many of them, which, introduced me to Dr. Markley, because I was giving tours to other professors. And it's great for your opportunities. They also write letters of recommendation, which can really help. And pro tip for everybody, I write lots of letters of recommendation. I love to do it. Give me a couple weeks notice, but get to know me a little bit, and I can throw some of those titles that I have, working for NASA and being on the board of directors. I didn't mention that I'm on the board of directors for one of those major national associations. I can use those credentials to help you out. And then, last thing, if nothing else with professional development and getting involved in a group like this, you will make connections, you'll meet fun people. That's been the best advantage for me is, those friendships and opportunities that have come from it. So I will shut up now. Thank you. Happy to take questions. Happy to talk with Ryan and Dr. Markley and just kind of keep it conversational if there aren't questions.
Great. I would just reinforce something you said, because there's research about students having a positive experience at university. And one of the things they've found has a clear correlation to a positive experience is the students getting engaged in student clubs, student organizations. And it can, especially in a commuter campus like Cal State Fullerton, it's very easy to drive in, drive out, not really get to know anybody. So it has positive outcomes. It reduces dropout rates. Gets people more engaged. So it'll help you professionally, but it'll also help you be happier at university. And I'm going to again take speaker's privilege to ask the first question. And it's actually just to ask you to tell us a story that you told me on our tour. You had a picture of the rover, and it was the story about how NASA didn't want JPL to put their name on that rover and how JPL tricked NASA. So could you tell us that story?
Yeah. So this was quite a while ago, but one of the rovers that we built, all of the spacecraft have NASA's logo on it. They don't get to have JPL's logo because NASA is not JPL. JPL is not NASA. I mean, we are, but it's one of those things where it's NASA is NASA. It doesn't matter which NASA center you are. We're all part of NASA, and it's NASA that's funding the work. And so NASA's logo goes on it. And the JPLers weren't terribly happy about that. This was a pretty big achievement to put another rover on Mars, especially one the size of Curiosity. And so the wheels on the rover have a bunch of holes in them in a very unique pattern that was designed, so it was designed for better traction and to help the rover move through the sand. But an added benefit of it is that when the rover drives through the sand, it leaves imprints, and that pattern on the wheels just happens to also in Morse code spell out JPL. So when the rover drives across Mars, the wheels are constantly imprinting JPL, 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 JPL across the surface of Mars.
That story really struck with me. Okay.
It's a fun one.
Yeah. So, anybody else got any questions they'd like to ask? You can just unmute yourself and go for it.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say thanks so much to both Ryan and JonLuc for sharing your experiences. It was very interesting to hear your career journey. And I have a question for JonLuc, and that is, are you hiring? I found your presentation like so inspiring, and I enjoyed all the photos that you shared, but I think the photo that made me the most excited was actually seeing the stacks of papers and all the filing and organization that's required. So I was, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. We're not hiring right now. My group did just fill a position because we were hiring, but you're all students. So I highly recommend you go to jobs.jpl.nasa.gov. And look at what opportunities are available. JPL each year, each summer brings in between 800 and 1,000 interns. It's one of the largest internship programs in the world for any industry. And you would be amazed at what opportunities are there. We at JPL, I mean, it's mostly science and engineering, but there are opportunities in business directorates, in contracts management. We have graphic arts, we have graphic designers, we have a video production group. JPL is very proud to announce we actually have 2 Emmys for the video production teams. So there are a lot of opportunities at JPL. So I highly recommend you check it out. And keeping up with me, adding me on LinkedIn and things, I can always send you opportunities when they come up.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Also, if it helps everybody, every NASA center is mandated to have a historian. So just a fun fact, every NASA center has a historian. Every NASA center has at least 1 archivist. There are 9 NASA centers across the country. So just something to keep in mind. Don't limit your options because you think NASA is not where a historian would go.
I just wanted to say it's really interesting hearing you and everything that you do, because there's actually a lot of similarities in stuff that I do, and you could see that it's all based on skill set that you develop, right? Like going back to the photo that she was referencing, man, that gave me, I just got hit in the face with a bunch of memories very recently, because I had to travel to quite a few different venues to go through all their cataloging of their logs. We have to have, I call it CYA, your cover your ass stuff, right? So you have to keep track of all these logs for visitors and who goes where. You got to log in and out of systems, but they also track every, like their ticket sales, their sales of for contracts, all this stuff that is a little bit different because you need to think about it in a risk perspective. So you need to kind of look at all this data to assess risk, and that has financial implications to the business and to the consumer. But I was the one sent everywhere to deal with everybody, all these venues, because of my background in history. In addition to my work ethic, it was mostly like, whoa, you're good at being able to catalog, distill the information that we need. I helped draft a data classification and retention policy. So there's a lot of business and legal classifications, and those have their own sets of retention. And then there's personal ones for the business. How long they keep deadwood. So ticket stubs is deadwood for venues in most cases. And so they're not interested in cataloging. They're interested in selling alcohol and tickets, right? So they put it in a locked room. They make us go over it every once in a while. And it is a benefit because I got to travel all over the place, and I'll continue to travel moving forward. That has its own ups and downs, but the benefit there is exactly what what you were saying, JonLuc, is that we are good at those things. We are good at archiving. We are good at understanding what records are necessary and what isn't. You know, moving forward, we have to be able to provide evidence on at least for a compliance side like that. How can you determine risk? And if there was ever a breach, if there was ever a problem, you have to be able to go back however long so you can try and identify where that problem came from, as well as eliminate you being the cause of that problem, preferably. So there's a lot of other financial and realistic implications there. And I take consumer data very importantly. Like, I try and look at my job as every time you guys buy a concert ticket, I'm trying to make sure that that transaction is secure. And a lot of that has to do with being able to catalog who has access to what systems, whether that's disgruntled internally and all that stuff. So compliance and governance is exactly what I do, payment security and governance. And to see how that correlates to other places like where you work, it's funny because it's just a skill set that we've developed over our history careers, and you could see it blossom in different patterns. Although, you know, this might just tell everybody go do something in compliance and governance. So that might be where you all wind up. So
yeah. But I mean, so really quickly to answer Karina's question in the chat, can you work at JPL with a bachelor's degree? You can work at JPL with an associate's degree, depending upon where you're working. I know many people who have an associate's degree. We have technical writers, we have, you know, contracts managers, we have business administrators, you know, people who are basically just admins and clerks, which you would think is, you know, a low person's job. Those people are the ones who keep the place running. Those are some of the smartest, most savvy people I know, and people with history degrees are very well suited for those types of roles. And you do that kind of role for a few years at JPL, and it will open up other opportunities when you start to use those transferable skills. So I wanted to answer that. But then going back to what Ryan was saying, yeah, I mean, so much of my work is compliance and such. But I wanted to harp on one thing that you said in a good way. You mentioned what's important, what's not important. And that is a massive part of my job. So we have in our collection over 70,000 boxes of paper records in storage. That doesn't include all of the records sitting in people's offices and storage rooms across those 150 buildings in those 188 acres for 10,000 employees. And that doesn't even touch the electronic records. We have thousands of electronic records keeping systems that are holding millions of documents and objects. I mean, literally millions. I know one system alone has over 35 million objects in it. One of the things that we have to do in my department is figure out what is worth keeping and what is not. And having a history background makes you exceptionally good at identifying value in documents. You got to be able to read quick. You got to be able to skim. You got to be able to quickly parse out and look at the history of where our institution has been and envision the future of where it's going to be and try to make those determinations on what is worth keeping and what is not, because you can't keep it all. It's incredibly expensive. And the more of it there is, the harder it is to find what you're actually looking for. And so any institution you work at, any place you go, I highly recommend you leverage that with your history degree. Leverage that skill of value assessment, because historians are exceptionally good at that.
And I'm going to relate what both of you said to ancient history, because when I'm teaching Roman Republic, Roman history, ancient China, the frustration we always have is the things they didn't think to tell us about. They were only interested in certain topics, and there's so many questions we'd like to know. I mean, a really obvious one is Roman concrete. Roman concrete was very different from modern concrete, and yet we don't know how they made it. Like, nobody ever wrote down a recipe or a formula for how they made it. It's just,
they could pour concrete underwater.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, some of it's, you know, records get lost over time, of course. But it's also, we have a whole, you know, a guy called Vitruvius who wrote all about, you know, aqueducts and architecture, but he never really wrote about the mechanics of how you do it. He was kind of like the officer, the general manager. But so much stuff we'd like to know today is just not there. And from my personal research, my grandfather ran World War I. we have this incredibly detailed military record of his experience. It'll tell us he got shot in the shoulder in 1916, the exact day, tells us where he was taken after he was shot. It tells us where he was, what hospital he was taken, and all that other stuff. But it doesn't tell us what the battle was, like what was the circumstance, how did he get wounded, and my grandfather never told us, and I can't work it out. Like how, and he wasn't even in a combat unit; he was in a baker's unit. So how did he get wounded? Was it a artillery shot? Like it's just not there. They just didn't think to record the piece of information about. They say where on his body he got wounded and where he was taken after he was wounded, but there's the information about how he actually got wounded in the first place. They just didn't bother to have a box in the form to write that down, so that information just simply didn't survive. So yeah, choosing which data to preserve. Yeah,
we use the Roman concrete example all the time at JPL. That is information that was lost for 2,000 years, was just how to make concrete at all. Which is devastating. But one of my favorite examples that we give at JPL is when we were building the Mars rovers. The most recent ones are so large we couldn't land them the way we used to, which is basically just putting them in giant airbags and bouncing them. And so they had to create what they called the sky crane maneuver. It's this object that hovers and drops the rover down on basically like a cord and a claw, lets go of it, and then shoots off. Well, in order to do that, they needed to build what was called a throttleable thruster. It was a thruster that could go up and down in power in order to make that spacecraft hover there while it was dropping the rover. And nobody knew how to do it. And they spent like over a year trying to figure it out, probably millions of dollars in science and research and people trying to figure out how to build these thrusters. And until one day, a really frustrated scientist, an engineer, was talking to one of his retired friends, one of his retired colleagues, and was like, we cannot figure out how to do this. And his colleague was like, what do you mean? That's what's on the Voyagers. We built that 40 years ago. What do you mean you don't know how to build them anymore? And sure enough, they come to records and to the archives, and they start pulling those materials and start looking at those thrusters. And sure enough, we had built them 40 years ago, and nobody thought to go to records and archives and look for those materials. Could have saved years and potentially millions of dollars. But that's why we preserve this. And historians have a great way of, I'm not the best at storytelling, but most historians are much better. Historians have a great way of using that storytelling to remind people of the importance of preserving these materials.
Great, thank you. Well, it's 8:27. Ryan and JonLuc, do you have any concluding words, or otherwise we'll just wrap it up?
I'll let Ryan go first because I've talked a lot.
I think I've said what I need to say. I mean, there's definitely a trace here, right? Understand your fundamental skill set, get involved, be vocal, make yourself seen. Definitely be in those communities, those connections. You hit me in the head with some more memories for Alpha Theta. I was like, oh yeah, all kinds of stuff. Be involved. The connections you make along the way help those organic things happen. And I know a lot of people say it's not, it's who you know, and that is a big relevant thing. But people aren't just going to be concerned about knowing you if you don't have your skill set out there and apparent and vocalize it and show how to use it. You know what I mean? So yes, knowing people is important, but making sure you understand your own capabilities and being able to interpret those so that other people can understand them, that's important.
Thank you, Ryan.
So just be introspective, focus on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll end with saying, make a LinkedIn, keep it updated, keep an updated resume, send it around, make those connections, keep in contact with people like me, with Ryan. I'll put my LinkedIn in the chat before we close out. And then the last piece of information I give people is just say yes. If an opportunity comes up, it may not be perfect. It may not be exactly what you thought it was. May be hard, may take extra of your time, but know your limits. But if you can make it fit in your life, even though it's hard or even though it's not perfect, just say yes to the opportunity, because you don't know what you'll fall in love with. You don't know where your passion will end up taking you. And you don't know what other doors it will open. And that's something that I've tried to do in my own career and has worked really well. just saying yes. There was an internship opportunity. I thought I had no chance in heck of doing it, and I applied for it because, you know, I could, and I knew that if I got it, I could give it the time that it needed, and it worked out. It took me in a whole different path.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. And so you said you were going to put that in the chat, your LinkedIn profile.
Yes.
And
I'll put it in right now.
I've told Ryan many times he needs to get to work on his LinkedIn profile. So I'm glad you're telling him that too.
Yeah, somebody's got one. Actually, I do need to, and I've been harping on. I've been saying, like, yeah, be marketable. Make sure it's out there. Should follow my own advice a little bit on that, on the LinkedIn portion. It's just I already get enough people. So
I'm terrible about posting or responding to it or anything like that. But I've seen many job opportunities, many, you know, even just being a consumer on LinkedIn and then having that place, if somebody wants to go look, can be incredibly valuable.
Yeah,
sure. Okay, well, thank you for those who came. I think this was incredibly interesting, and I hope that everybody else found it valuable. And yep, I see Diana nodding away vigorously.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again for sharing all your insight. It was a wonderful, you know, learning opportunity for me to hear about your journey. So thank you. And thank you, Dr. Markley. It's so good to see you again after so much time.
You too, you're looking well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I plan to graduate this semester. So I'll be out there hunting.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, so on that note, we'll call it a night. Thank you so much, JonLuc and Ryan. I found this, honestly, I mean, I thought it would be interesting, but I found it far more interesting and valuable than I expected. So I'm really going to pump this out, this recording, and I really hope others watch it because I think they'll get a lot out of it. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the
Good night.
recording.